William Wordsworth captured the simple beauty of a daffodil for eternity. Stay tuned for this poem time video. Hi guys, I'm so excited to be here for another opportunity to grow, to learn, and to be inspired. And today I am very excited because this is the first video of my poem time series. And poetry is something so beautiful, so powerful. And I've always wanted to read more poetry. I've always wanted to make the time to read more poetry. But somehow, with life and the way things have been, I haven't really gotten there. And this series is my excuse to actually read all the poetry that I've always wanted to read. And I get to share it with you. Great poetry has the power to transform our souls, to awaken us if we've been asleep or perhaps half awake. The brilliant American poet Walt Whitman believed poetry could recover wisdom and propagate it. And I think that is so special, because in that belief there is an understanding that there is a wisdom and beauty in the world that goes beyond our comprehension, that is everywhere, in nature, in the way we interact with people, in the way we feel things, in the way we create things. And great poetry and great poets somehow, in a moment of time, are able to capture this. They're able to absorb this wisdom into their souls and then transform it into words and give it to us. The great Greek philosopher Plato believed that truth is eternal, that it existed long before us and it will continue to exist long after us. And what sublime poetry can do is it can tap into this truth, into this wisdom, and manifest itself in those words, in those expressions that a human being was able to capture, was able to tap into, was able to call within the beauty, the wisdom, the truth of the world into a poem, into words that then make us feel that truth, that wisdom, that beauty. And in feeling that, we transform ourselves, or it helps us to transform ourselves, whether it is by expanding our perspective, by filling our day with a little bit more wisdom and beauty that now we're aware of. And then we can give it back to the world. William Wordsworth's poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, is special to me because it is special to my mother. My mom grew up in India. She is Indian. She was born in Calcutta and grew up in New Delhi. And this poem took her to a different world. Instead of the scorching heat of New Delhi, she was suddenly transported to the British countryside in the spring with clear blue skies and puffy clouds and yellow daffodils. My mother had never traveled, much less anywhere like England, like anywhere where she could imagine a beautiful English countryside. When my mother was 4, her grandfather died. And they had been a very prominent family and wealthy. And his best friend swindled them out of everything. And my mother had to live in a 2-bedroom apartment in New Delhi. There is no such thing as air conditioning back then. There is no such thing as the comforts we know of today. And if you've been to India or anywhere close to India, or you can imagine that heat. And for my mother's life was very, very difficult, fraught with poverty and pain, and books and poetry were her escape. And I think that poetry can play that role for many people. it can, if a poet has done a good job of capturing the essence of something, it is as if there is no distance between us and that expression of beauty or that description of something. It takes us there. That is the beauty of it. So let's get inspired and read. I wandered as lonely as a cloud. I wandered as lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. They stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. What a beautiful poem. And I'm trying to imagine my mom as a little girl with no hope, with no, well, she did have hope because of these poems, because of the stories that she read. There was a world beyond the scorching heat and poverty of New Delhi that she was used to. There was a world beyond for her to imagine, and in this case, a world of British spring and countryside and beautiful yellow daffodils, thanks to William Wordsworth. My favorite line is, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. There's such joyous imagery here. Sprightly, joyous, cheerful. Jocund means cheerful. So these daffodils, they're dancing in the breeze. They're fluttering, they're moving. You can feel that cool breeze. And if you can imagine, this was a field of daffodils. Wordsworth wrote this in 1804. In 1802, he took a walk with his sister to the countryside. And they were walking by a British lake, and they came upon this field of daffodils. And at first they thought it was just a few, but then they realized that, it was just a massive sort of wave of daffodils, like an ocean, a yellow ocean. And it was such a beautiful sight. But this inspiration, it's not like Wordsworth sat down and wrote this poem right there. No. It was 2 years later that he recalled that memory. And he did so because his sister had written about this in her journal. Her journal entry and her recollection of this time on the daffodils is actually beautiful. And that is what inspired him 2 years later to write this poem, to capture that. The beauty of poetry, in many ways, is that we internalize the beauty and the wisdom that we have experienced. And when we're ready, when some people are ready, in this case Wordsworth, they're able to mold that inspiration and to capture something forever. Many times we see the world through other people's eyes. We see ourselves reflected in others. And in this case, this is arguably one of Wordsworth's most famous poems, if not the most famous. And it was through the eyes of his sister that he saw the beauty of these daffodils, perhaps a second time. And then he was able to recall his own experience and marry hers with his to create this. Much like this poem means so much to me because it recalls my mother's own experience. Poetry has a way of connecting us, not only to nature, not only to feelings, but to others, to the experience that others may have that has transformed their life somehow. William Wordsworth is credited with co-starting the Romantic movement. And the Romantic movement is not a movement where people are writing romantic as in the love between people. No, it's not that kind of romantic. The Romantic philosophy was characterized by believing that the natural world is an analog of the spiritual world. In other words, it means that God lives in his creation. Wordsworth and the Romantics believed that when we commune with nature, we commune with that ultimate intelligence, much like Whitman and Plato. There is a belief there that there is an intelligent beauty in all things. And when you can appreciate and see the whole world in a flower, in the beauty, in the simplicity, in the sprightly joy of a daffodil, perhaps you have somehow tapped into something that's universal, into a beauty that we can all relate to across time, across generations. In an entirely different continent, 100 years later, a little girl in India was reading "I Wandered as Lonely as a Cloud" and was picturing herself somewhere else, was picturing a world that did not belong to her. But in the moment of reading that poem, anything was possible. And then many, many, many decades later, her daughter reads this poem, hears her story about why this poem is so special, and now it becomes special to me. Now it has its own meaning for me. And that is one of the supreme powers of great poetry. Poetry that is so inspired that hundreds of years later you can read it and you can feel that moment. You can understand that image, that feeling, what all your senses are engaged in the experience that the poet has brought forth through his inspiration. And as I was thinking of this poem, I caught myself thinking of the title, and I thought to myself, I've never thought of clouds as being lonely. Have you? I kept picturing one lonely puffy cloud in a blue sky, which isn't necessarily rare to see, but most of the time I'm used to seeing sort of a mass of clouds, especially in the Midwest or in the south of the United States. You know, you have those massive rain clouds or simply just a cloudy sky. I've always tried to make shapes out of the clouds, so they're always together. So I was trying to think of just one lonely cloud. And then I thought to myself, well, why is the cloud lonely to begin with? And then I thought, okay, well, if I'm thinking of a mass of clouds, I'm thinking of a place like New York City where I've lived. And I'm thinking of the hundreds of people that walk the streets and how utterly lonely it felt to be there, even though I was surrounded by people. So I was thinking, okay, is this cloud surrounded by other clouds and yet lonely? And then I stopped thinking of the cloud necessarily, or the cloud as being lonely, and I started to think of the wandered in the title. And I thought, well, if a cloud up above, think about it, a cloud is never stationary. A cloud is always on the move. It's always transient, and it can see everything, right? So I'm thinking, this cloud in 1804 or sometime in 1802 was passing by this field of daffodils and sort of caught that glimpse that Wordsworth was able to capture. So that loneliness wasn't necessarily lonely. I think it's more of a solitude. In our culture, loneliness has somewhat of a bad connotation, while solitude doesn't. Solitude is something we do to derive wisdom, I think a lot of people understand the need to be alone sometimes, to be in solitude, to be able to think, to be able to process things, to be able to feel things. In Spanish, there actually isn't a different word for solitude and loneliness, and that always caught me. I'm always fascinated by that, by the ways different languages express a concept like loneliness or solitude. In Spanish, the way you say the word solitude or to be alone in context is how you can tell whether somebody is in a solitude of contemplation or a loneliness that is somewhat sad. And of course, in Wordsworth's poem, I believe this lonely cloud is more of a solitary cloud. And one of the lines most famous in this poem is, well, a couple of lines is, "For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude." That inward eye, of course, is our souls. And in this case, the image of the daffodils has sort of come to him in a moment of inspiration, where he's connected to the beauty of nature, to the wisdom, to that ultimate intelligence, and given it to us. And in this beautiful poem, Wordsworth is not just a lonely cloud gazing upon these daffodils. He partakes in this experience. He dances with them as they toss their heads, as they sprightly dance, and they outdo the waves. In one poem, we're being transported through his inner intuition, through his inner eye of being able to perceive this beauty to the whole world, really. When you think of the stars, when you think of the ocean, when you think of the Milky Way. And of course, to me, it's taking me to India, to my mother's past, to her memory, to a moment in time where there was beauty in her life, in a time when there was none. So did you guys like I Wandered as Lonely as a Cloud? What did it make you think about? Are there poems in your life that take you somewhere else, that are special to you because they gave you something at a specific time in your life that meant something to you? That's the beauty and the power of poetry. There is beauty everywhere in the world. It's just a matter of perspective, of observation, of opening up your heart and your eyes to things you haven't seen before, or seeing things in a way that are different. Thank you guys for watching. I can't wait to be inspired. Next video.